Well, talked about Bunny, let's talk about Sally. Sally Acorn is probably one of the more enduring characters in the minds of fans. In fact, she got her first mention all the way back in the Sonic Bible, yes, that one for once. Which of course led to her having a few cameos in Fleetway Sonic, but we all know this isn't the version of her that comes to mind when someone says Sally Acorn. We all think of Sad AM, the Archie comics, the tactical mind behind the Freedom Fighters, the on-again, off-again love interest. And she's still talked about all the time. Some people miss her and want her to return, and some people still complain about her. Honestly, if you look at how the fandom talks about some other characters, it's like she never left. Force's background cameos notwithstanding, it's almost been 9 years since the princess has made a proper appearance. So it may surprise you that at one point she had her own solo book. Today we'll be checking out the Princess Sally miniseries. So yes, if you didn't already know, it might surprise you that in 1995, Sally got her own book. What's even more surprising is that this predated both Tails and Knuckles' solo minis as well. I know some people are going to immediately assume that this was an Archie decision, but no, actually. According to Ken Penders on his old forum, it's not even something they wanted to publish. It was Sega who actually requested this book to be made, because they were debating on making a Sally Acorn game at the time. I get that sounds crazy, and a lot of people's first instinct is not to believe Ken when he says something like this, but I don't have a reason to not believe him in this case. 1995 was the year games like Knuckles Chaotix, Tails Adventure, and Tails Sky Patrol were all released. It was the year Sega was experimenting with spin-offs. And with Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine 2 years prior, that shows Sega was pretty open to using imagery that originated from the western side of the franchise. If I don't mention Sally's Spinball cameo, I'll get 100 comments about it. Also, it wasn't the first time Sega considered creating a Sonic spin-off aimed at girls. Hey Sega, where's my RPG starring Amy? She can recruit characters after battles, because that's a whole thing she does. Then there's also cancelled projects like Sonic 16 or Sonic Mars that would have featured Sally, so timeline-wise, Ken's story makes a lot of sense. And it's something he's stuck to, so I do believe him in this case. Penders and Mike Kintarovic's first pitch was to introduce Sally's mom, Alicia, but instead of being comatose, she would have been a roboticized tyrant living in the sewers of Robotropolis, being a villain but still being at odds with Robotnik. Sega said no to this one. The second story they pitched was, quote, a Thelma and Louise style adventure featuring Sally and Bunny taking on Robotnik and his minions, to which Sega also said no to. In retrospect, I do think it's crazy they turned that one down. They're easily the two most popular characters to come out of Sad AM, so I think a game starring their two leading ladies could have done well. It's easy to think of Sally and Bunny as besties, and while they'd be paired up sometimes and even have little moments together, I don't feel we ever really explored what their dynamic is. Finally, they just asked Sega's licensing department what they even wanted, to which they responded that they could only use Sally and Robotnik, and nothing else previously established. No Sonic, no Tails, no Knuckles, nothing from the games. Sounds like a crazy restriction to be put under, but I imagine it's the same restriction that resulted in, like, Witch Cart. So Ken and Mike put together a story about Sally recruiting and training a whole new group of freedom fighters against Robotnik. And this was the one that got approved. So let's check it out. Our story actually begins in a prologue in Sonic the Hedgehog number 20. This issue features a brief story where Sally goes on a solo mission to one of Robotnik's energy substations in order to destroy it. The vast majority of this part is told without dialogue, and I actually like it a whole lot. The art team is composed of Art Mawhinney and Rich Kozlowski, and the art really speaks for itself. I specifically really like this bit where the countdown for the explosion is shown in between the panels. It really heightens the dramatic tension. Unfortunately, the comic then introduces Jeffrey St. John. Look, Jeffrey will probably get his own video at some point, so I won't get into his specific issues here, so we'll just pretend the later stuff didn't happen yet. According to Ken, when he and Mike were working on new characters for the mini, they decided they should also introduce a new love interest. The inspirations were Pepe Le Pew, though they decided to make him British because Antoine was already French, and James Bond. Odd for Ken to say he's British when he's written with an Australian accent. Jeffrey initially doesn't recognize Sally, thinking she might be working with Robotnik, though the confusion is cleared up once the explosion goes off. After this, he introduces himself as a former member of His Majesty's Secret Service and the current leader of the Rebel Underground. Sally is suspicious, having never heard of them. The miniseries then picks up exactly where the prologue left off, with the two fleeing from a group of swap bots and narrowly escaping. After this, we're introduced to our new band of freedom fighters: Penelope Platypus, Arlo Armadillo, Dylan Porcupine, and Hamlin. I don't like him. In fact, as a character, I think I dislike him more than Jeffrey. This isn't retroactive hate either, though he does pull some nonsense later. I hated him from the jump. His role in this story is to complain. In fairness to him, he and Jeffrey don't get off to the best start, as Jeffrey mistakes him for an enemy, but Jeffrey does attempt to apologize, only for Hamlin to attempt to start another fight with him before Sally breaks it up. The next day, Sally briefs her new team on her plan: to destroy all of Robotnik's energy substations to take out Robotropolis's defense system. She succeeded in destroying one earlier, and now they have to work together to take out the remaining two. Jeffrey and Hamlin argue more. This will be a running theme. They manage to get into the second substation, and Sally activates its self-destruct sequence just as its security bots arrive. They manage to take one out, with Jeffrey saving Hamlin from being crushed, and they make it out of the building before it explodes. But unfortunately, so does one of the robots. Thankfully, they are able to fool it into walking off of a cliff. Sally comments that the security must have been toughened up, to which Hamlin immediately accuses Jeffrey of being a traitor, despite the fact that the skunk just saved Hamlin's life, something that Sally also points out. The first issue ends with Jeffrey sneaking away from their camp in the middle of the night and heading to a lab, where there seems to be an exact duplicate of Sally sitting in a tube. Next issue starts with Jeffrey and Hamlin fighting again. In this case, it looks like Hamlin literally asked for it. After the skunk takes down his opponent, Sally also takes him down, commenting to remember that they're fighting against Robotnik, not each other. They head to the third energy substation, which is on an island, so they have to hang glide to it. Unfortunately, once again, their plans are anticipated, resulting in Arlo being shot out of the sky. Upon landing, they find him, only to discover he's broken his leg, making Penelope offer to stay with him. The rest of the group enters the energy substation and plants bombs, only to be interrupted by one of the worst looking robots I've ever seen. It's called an octopod, so funnily enough it does share a name with a planned enemy from Sonic Mars and Sonic Extreme, but they are very different looking. The group manages to get free of its clutches, destroy it, and escape the building before it explodes. Strangely, Arlo and Penelope are gone without a trace. Sally suggests they leave, only for Hamlin to say that's a crazy idea, but Sally manages to talk him into it. After returning to their campsite, they wait for their missing comrades to return, though they never do. Once again, Jeffrey sneaks out in the dead of night, this time with an unconscious Sally. He enters the lab and puts Sally in a tube before radioing to Robotnik. It's obviously Robotnik, that the exchange has been made, as he lets out the copy Sally from the tube. And the next morning, the copy Sally takes Hamlin and Dylan on a mission to Robotropolis, while Jeffrey delivers the real Sally to Robotnik. Next issue sees the remaining trio making their way through Robotropolis. Hamlin has to be rescued, rip Bozo. Eventually, though, they are confronted by Robotnik and Jeffrey, who were very clearly waiting for them. Hamlin attempts to fight Jeffrey, might as well squeeze that in one more time, only for Sally to reveal that she's on Robotnik's side. Robotnik finally lays out his grand scheme, that the energy substations were never powering Robotropolis' defense system. It was all a ruse. His larger plan is to replace the leaders of the Resistance with identical automatons, while he roboticizes the real ones. However, when he attempts to roboticize Sally, the machine explodes. Robotnik realizes that what he had just tried to roboticize was the robot Sally, and the real one is standing in front of him. Robotnik calls forth his stealth bots to defend him, only for Jeffrey to respond by calling in the Rebel Underground for assistance. Rather than accept defeat, however, the Doctor initiates a self-destruct protocol for his base before escaping. They recreate the countdown bit from the beginning, though it feels not as effective here, and do manage to make it out. Now, if everything I just said was confusing, don't worry, the book thinks so too, as the last couple pages are spent explaining every part of the twist. Sally had actually been replaced by the robot since the beginning of the first issue, and when Jeffrey was delivering Sally to Robotnik, he was actually freeing the real Sally and giving Robotnik the robot. Penelope and Arlo disappeared because the Rebel Underground rescued them. They then point out the ways the reader could have told the difference between the real Sally and the robot.
That particular exchange corresponded with subtle differences I noted but failed to heed. The robot always referred to Jeffrey by his given name, while the princess referred to him as Mr. St. John.
Why does he talk like this? They also point out that the vest is a different color as well. I have thoughts about this, we'll talk about it later. As our story ends, Sally invites Jeffrey to join the Knothole Freedom Fighters, but he declines as the Rebel Underground also needs him. Before the two part, they kiss, and Sally walks off into the sunset. This series did not sell well. I'm sure you guessed that by the fact we only had a Princess Sally miniseries and not a Princess Sally ongoing. Or a Sally video game, for that matter. Sega did not like the book either. The reason that's commonly stated for its poor sales is that it was not marketed like a girl's comic. Now, I know what that means in the year of 2025, but what did that mean in the year 1995? Was there a market for that? We're going to be looking at some sales figures courtesy of Comicron. They only document pre-order numbers from comic book stores, and at this point in the 90s, there were still a lot of ways to get comics outside of comic book stores. But I still think it's informative to use as a sample size. In January of 1995, while Sonic number 21 sold 1,600 units, Sally number 2 sold 900 units. Sub 1,000 units is pretty bad, but it did do better than the Sonic In Your Face special, which only sold 400 units. I assume because the cover looks like that. Unfortunately, that book's lead story was also Sally focused. Not looking great for her. But we all know what comics looked like in the 90s. You could argue, hey, maybe there just wasn't really a market for younger girls reading comics. But, no, there definitely was. It wasn't the majority, it was more niche, but it existed. Marvel's Little Mermaid number 7 sold 4,500 units. And also from Marvel, Barbie number 51 sold 2,500 units. Over at Archie, Betty number 24 sold 1,400 units, while Veronica number 42 sold 1,300. These are just the ones that jumped out at me on a list of 600 titles, so there could be more, but this does show, yes, there was a prevalent, albeit smaller market for comics aimed at little girls. While I doubt Sally could have ever sold as well as something like The Little Mermaid or Barbie, I'm not delusional. I think there was a chance this book could have sold better if it was marketed differently. I do want to talk about the ads they ran for this book. Archie, despite their feelings about it, did do their best to market the series, placing ads in both Sonic and non-Sonic books alike. One thing that sort of stands out though is that these ads all use different covers than the final ones we got. I know the saying is don't judge a book by its cover, but with comics, having a good cover is sort of key in getting people to buy an issue sometimes. And while I think the final covers we got are a little too busy, I find my eyes darting around the page to different details. The characters feel too small with just a lot of negative space.
There's nothing there.
And even in higher quality restorations, the colors don't pop quite the way they should, and it ultimately looks muddy. They are at least depicting Sally looking cool. Capable leader, coming to the rescue, fighting her clone. That's a character I'd want to read about. With these other covers, while I like the connected covers, I would probably buy these in a set, Sally's depiction on them isn't the best. Like, yeah, she says in the ad, "It's really true, everybody, I'm a star now." And then the covers are her looking worried or confused and getting captured. There is one cover where she's doing cool hero stuff, but they covered that one up. Not just in this ad either. I found another one where they covered it up even more and drew the most attention to the being captured cover. There's another alternate cover they showed for number 1 that's just her being shot at and looking scared. These are covers that sort of scream, our protagonist is not capable. Which isn't even true of Sally in this miniseries. Her resourcefulness is like a whole thing. I think these ads definitely did have an impact on sales. Because what kids were sending away $4, $5 Canadian, to read about someone getting captured? The failure of this miniseries had a pretty unfortunate impact, as according to Ken, this made the powers that be, meaning editorial, anyone above him with decision-making power, certain Sonic was a boys-only title. Today, while I think you can argue that the franchise occasionally skews to certain demographics, overall, I think it's often a franchise for everybody. People from all walks of life enjoy Sonic, and I'm very glad that the idea that it's a boys-only thing has kind of faded away over time. I've seen a lot of people say that the poor sales for this series is the reason Sally almost got killed off, but I couldn't find a first-hand source of that, but I did find Ken giving a different reason, that he felt that she made Sonic feel like Second Banana and cramped his style, which I think is a funny thing to say when you're the one writing the comic. Overall, I wish I could say positive things about this mini. This was an era where Ken did manage to turn in some stuff that at minimum was okay. But from the way he talks about it on his forum, it really seems like no one ended up liking the series by the end of its production. I have some key problems with it, like the fact that it's Sally's miniseries, but due to her being replaced with a robot at the beginning, she's not even present for half of it. I like the idea of providing subtle hints like the change in vest color or how she talks about Jeffrey that make it clear upon reread when the switches happen, and on a technical level, it's done correctly, but I think its presentation has problems. Like, the reader really only gets 2 instances to pick up on that Sally calls him Mr. St. John beforehand, which could easily be read as just not knowing him well yet. And then another 2 instances after the second switch, unless you count her just saying St. John without the Mr. part as a third. Honestly, these panels do the most to give it away, because in any other context, it's just a strange exchange. The Rebel Underground gets mentioned very briefly at the beginning of the miniseries, and then they come back to save the day at the end. I get that in concept they're sort of working off of the Chekhov's gun principle, that the only reason they were ever mentioned is because they were going to be narratively important, but I think a mention in the second issue beyond the recap page would have made it feel a little more earned. Next, the kiss. I get they wanted to introduce a new love interest for Sally, but they don't really do anything to establish their chemistry. Closest they get to flirting is him playfully insulting her. Not that it matters anyway, cause we know this is not the real Sally. Based on the story's own logic, Jeffrey and the real Sally have known each other for a little over 24 hours collectively. So this doesn't feel earned. Lastly, I don't think the story does a good job of actually exhibiting Sally as a character. Let's just say that we agree with the book. That character-wise, the robot Sally and Sally proper, personality-wise, are indistinguishable. What are the traits on display? That she's a good leader? She has the traits of a good leader? She doesn't like her team infighting? One of the intro pages for these issues describes her. Entrusted with the lives of her charges, the young princess wears the mantle of leadership stoically. Often called upon to make tough choices by virtue of her rank, she longs for the day when peace and prosperity once again reign over the planet Mobius. I don't actually think that's a good description of Sally's character. Yeah, she's a good leader, but I don't think stoic is a word I'd use. When things go wrong, she takes it hard, because she takes a lot of personal responsibility for it. She's smart and a good leader, but like a lot of other characters, emotions can definitely overrule her better judgment. That's an aspect of her that's interesting. That stoic leader is probably something she aspires to be, but what gets in the way of that is existing as she is. Here, when something goes wrong, she feels bad about it. It's for 1 or 2 panels. It does not get to be explored. In a perfect world, this miniseries would have gotten a few more passes at its script before seeing print. Like, cumulatively, these problems make the story rough to read, but they are all things that could be addressed in editing. I don't want to get in the habit of suggesting fixes, but like, why not do the first swap between issues 1 and 2 rather than at the beginning of issue 1? Because why does Jeffrey even go to the lab that night? That way the reader has more time to pick up on the nuances in how Sally refers to Jeffrey, and if you're set on making him her love interest, you actually have time to develop Sally and Jeffrey's dynamic. Throw in another mention of the Rebel Underground in the second issue, hint at their name being very literal, they have a big drill car, or maybe remove that entirely. The finale is a little cluttered. How many twists can you fit in one scene before it becomes excessive? These wouldn't completely fix the story, it'd still have to be retuned in a few different ways, but those are things I think would make it a better read. In the end, this comic really ends up being another interesting artifact from a time when the franchise had a lot of growing pains. As for Sally, I am in the group that wouldn't mind her and the other freedom fighters returning one day. If not as part of Sonic, maybe as their own IP. It's been 30 years since Sally's miniseries. Maybe it's time to give the concept another shot with 3 decades worth of hindsight. Thank you all so much for watching. I want to thank my patrons and give a special shout out to my $5 patrons, Ned Rex, NateDM990, Diddly Do, and Queer Kaiju. See y'all in the next video.